All right, so now we're going to go into component parts, and we're going to look at vision and perceptual organization and interpretation, and then the non-visual aspects of our world and how we process the world around us. As we've already been talking about, we mentioned the idea of transduction and how that is the transformation or the transformation of external environmental stimuli into into neural impulses, and we have to have something that takes the raw data, the raw information coming from our environment, to interpret it or to translate it into the neural information or language of our neural system. And so in transduction, essentially light waves are, at least from the visual perspective, light waves are converted into neural impulses by the retina and then are coded, and these impulses travel up the optic nerve into the brain cortexes, into the brain cortex, where they are then interpreted, otherwise known as perception. So in organizing the data, the sensory data, into a whole perception, we break it down into component parts again, discriminating figure from ground. We organize the figure into meaningful form by following certain rules of grouping stimuli, and all of that is part of what we're just going to unpack here as we move along. But let's start with the most core component. And the let me fill this out while I'm doing it. So stimuli is translated into neural impulses, just as a review, okay? Now, the one thing that will translate between two different areas of senses is visual and auditory have one thing in common, and it really is that the information coming into them comes by way of waves that are on the electromagnetic scale, and particularly when we electromagnetic, let me get this down, scale, is we perceive or sense a very relatively small, thin slice of this broad spectrum that we refer to as electromagnetic energy. And that's part of light waves. Now, when we talk about sound, we talk about what? Sound waves. And there are two key concepts that are important to understand in terms of waves. The first one is the idea of the wave length of the wavelength first is one concept. The second concept is the wave amplitude. So not only length, you can look at this down here, and amplitude. And I'll put it in everyday language so you understand it, because you are processing stuff that you don't even really probably realize. So when I draw a wave, and granted it may not be the greatest in the world, but it is about as close as I can get using this tablet. The wavelength goes from this point to this point. In other words, how much are they bunched together? That's the length of the wave itself, okay? From this point right here and down to the base point is what we refer to as amplitude. So this is frequency. That's usually the language of wavelength. How frequently do they occur? And this is amplitude. In other words, how deep the wave is. And amplitude and frequency are the key components in understanding not only light, but also in terms of sound. Both of those play a part. For example, the wavelength, the frequency of these determines, at least in terms of light, determines the hue or of a color, how deep to how light it might be. In terms of amplitude, this has to do with intensity, which also then translates to us as brightness. Bright. And those two key components are part of what we refer to. And the wavelength and the amplitude will come up again when we talk about sound waves. The same idea occurs in terms of how loud something is, in terms of frequency, and then the timbre of it in terms of amplitude, which is another example of that. So those are some key components. Now let's break down the diagram of the eye, and I would encourage you to download this diagram and fill it out as we go along here so that you can do the same yourself. So essentially, as light enters, and everything's moving in this direction, as light enters, it enters, first of all, passes through the cornea, which is the outer coating of the eye. A lot of times it can be scratched and you may have a sore eye because of something you got under your eyelid or whatever. A scratched cornea is certainly painful, and it can heal just like most everything else in your eye is concerned. Once the light passes through the cornea out here, the next point of entry is the pupil, which is this area, and it's constricted or dilated by the iris. And so the lens itself is here. This is the iris. It's a muscle. Oftentimes gives our eyes the colors that they do. And like I said, it constricts or dilates depending on the light of the ambient lighting, so that more light can be allowed in or less light can be allowed in. This area right here is the lens, and essentially the lens is with these muscles up here is either thinned or thickened so that the image itself can be focused on the back of the retina. And the retina is filled with a variety of photosensitive cells, which we refer to as rods or cones. Now, this expansion of the lens is referred to as, let me see if I can bring this out here, is accommodation that I described to you when there is there it is, accommodation. And essentially, it thickens or thins the lens in order to have the image fall on the retina at the correct place and the correct amount of focus. This is filled with rods and cones that are sensing, are photosensitive to either hues of white, black and white, or color. These are easy to remember simply because of rods have to do with black and white. I'm going to run out of white space here. And cones, I've always remembered cones easily because cone starts with a C, and that has to do with color. So rods black and white, cones color. The other component parts that we're talking about and looking at here is the fovea, because the lens is focusing everything down to the fovea where we are processing the information of the light cells itself. Down here is the blind spot where the optic nerve leaves the retina. All of these cells congregate together into what we refer to as the optic nerve itself. And in a sense, one way to think about it is that the cells of the optic nerve kind of spread out around the surface of the retina. And in a lot of ways, when you look at it, it's kind of backwards. You would expect it to have all the rods and cones, if you will, at the front, when in fact they are on the back side of it, and we'll look at that in a little bit more detail. But you should be able to label an eyeball like this: the pupil, the cornea, iris, lens, retina, fovea, optic nerve, and blind spot relatively easily. A lot of times when we talk about people who have are nearsighted or farsighted, this lens is part of the problem. It's focusing it either too short, and so the candle ends up being translated here, or it's too long and it's translated out here, and it's not focused on either direction. So this is nearsighted, this is farsighted, and in either case, that's what corrective lenses allow us to do. A lot of times this doesn't is either shaped inappropriately, or even the eyeball itself is shaped more elongated or short in that regard, and that's what creates this poor image.